We're listening to us for the first time, please subscribe and share this podcast with your friends. We have the great Ion Sancho on, supervisor of elections from 89 to 2007. That's probably a record, not just in the
2016. 2016.
2016. I'm sorry. 2000, regardless, 2016, 17, that is a record probably in the state of Florida and around the country as a supervisor of elections in Leon County. People that don't know the state of Florida, we're talking about Tallahassee, Florida, the state capital. Ion, it's always a pleasure to have you on and talk politics, talk elections, and voting.
Well, it's my pleasure, Rob, and we're here some 16 days away from the election, and I know I've been doing my part. I've been going around different counties in the North Florida area talking about voting, because that's what they bring me in to talk about: how to vote by mail, how to make sure that you have your vote counted when you cast it here in Florida, because Florida changed the rules after the 2020 election, after Governor DeSantis markedly told the American people that Florida was the gold standard. Then he bombed the gold standard and changed to something else. And changing vote by mail. And this is a trend that happened all across the country, because for people that really have not been paying attention, right-wing groups such as Heritage Action started right after the 2020 election to attack vote by mail. And there was one reason, and one reason only, for that, Rob. In Florida, for example, 1.5 million more Democrats voted by mail than Republicans. First time in our history that ever happened. So right off the bat, vote by mail was attacked, particularly vote by mail drop boxes, which were limited. They can be open no longer, for example, than the hours of the actual early voting site. Some supervisor of elections, like Pete Antonacci, who would go on to become the first head of Florida's infamous election police, took the vote by mail drop boxes and put them inside the early voting. So you have to wait in line with everybody else to use what was a simple drop it in the box and leave approach before. I will tell you, though, that in-person voting has not been changed in the state of Florida. So when I'm going around, particularly minority groups in neighboring Gadsden County, early voting is available. The same kind of early voting that, quite frankly, elected Obama in Florida in 2008. And most people don't realize that Charlie Crist played a critical role in the election of candidate Obama to president here in Florida, because South Florida early voting polls were overwhelmed with African Americans waiting in line for 2, 3, 4 hours. And using his authority as a Republican governor, Charlie Crist extended early voting across the state of Florida for 2 additional hours every day in the last week of early voting to accommodate the large number of African American voters, which became the determining factor in why Obama was elected in 2008. So here is an individual who's a Republican that acted in the interests of the citizens. And that's increasingly rare today. And of course, Governor Crist is now a candidate. He's running for the state of Florida's governorship again as a Democrat.
Yeah.
And they had a debate last night, and it was very, very interesting. I particularly liked the 10 seconds of dead air that occurred when Charlie asked Governor DeSantis, are you going to commit to staying for 4 more years for the citizens of Florida? And you have that infamous 10 seconds of dead air.
Right.
Yeah, as he refused to answer the question.
Yeah, I watched the debate last night. It was very interesting why he didn't answer that question. Obviously, we know the answer to that as viewers of the debate, that he's trying to run for president, so he will not commit. Otherwise, that would be a lie if he did that and ran. I want to talk about this because I want to go back to 2008. For people listening, I'm going back 2018 rather, and I'm going back to that date because that was the last midterm we had here in the state of Florida and around the country, of course. But this is very, went on in 2018 is very important to what is going to go on right now. We saw the election was extremely close between Andrew Gillum and also Ron DeSantis as a candidate 32,000 votes. Obviously, a lot went into that 2018 race where there was an issue in Miami-Dade County, which a lot of people don't bring up. And I'm sure you know this, Ion, where there was a Hispanic man that was a MAGA supporter. He did send bombs to a lot of different politicians. They went through this Miami-Dade processing plant for the mail, stopped a lot of mail-in ballots from going through. That could have had an effect on the Nelson race and maybe even somewhat of the Gillum race. But with that said, there was a lot of issues with that election. Also, the recounts in Palm Beach and Broward County, the suspension of those election officials when Governor DeSantis took office and putting new people in those positions. A lot of new things going on in elections. But let's go back to 18. If you can tell the viewers about why these issues are so important with these new people in Palm Beach and Broward County, which are Democratic strongholds in the state of Florida.
Well, Broward County had been the #1 performing Democratic county in the state of Florida. In fact, in the Bill Clinton election in '92, Broward County was the most Democratic performing county in the United States of America.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And they suspended, Jeb Bush suspended their supervisor of elections, a young, attractive African-American woman, and they put in someone who immediately plummeted the African-American turnout in Broward County. Broward County then went to the worst voting urban county in the state of Florida. And that's what elections and election officials can do to a jurisdiction. You really need to have good election officials in terms, and then Governor DeSantis, after he removed the election official that Jeb Bush put in 2018, he put in a political fixer known as Pete Antonacci, who did these things such as move the early voting sites move the vote by mail drop box inside the early voting location so it'd be harder to use. And then after the election, he goes on to become Governor DeSantis's first police chief of the elections police that he created, which quite frankly is to, in my opinion, intimidate election administrators. Because you see, in Florida, we elect every election official. I was elected for 7 terms to complete my 28 years here in the state of Florida. And so we have independent authority that Governor DeSantis absolutely abhors as he tries to do this top-down control process over all public officials. You saw what he did to the state attorney down in Hillsborough County, Chris Warren, where he removed him because he had the temerity to speak his opinion. And he was removed from office. He invoked no law. There was no case. He removed him because he said something that DeSantis didn't like. And that's what we're seeing also with the election police on a supervisor of elections. They are there to intimidate the election officials, to make the election officials fall into line with more of Governor DeSantis's policies relative to elections. And it's a sad commentary that we really have now subjected to our elections to this kind of politicization, whether it's in Florida or Arizona or Georgia or Pennsylvania or Michigan, because elections are under attack, Rob, all over the country, all over the country. I have people that I know and worked with over the years, they're quitting, quite frankly. The supervisor of elections in Brevard County, the Titusville area, a longtime Republican supervisor of elections, quit after the October primary, threw her hands up and said, "I'm done with you." The Republicans have been filing public records requests, demanding things that quite frankly are irrelevant, but under Florida law, you have to do due diligence to produce these public records. Well, that kind of acts almost as a physical denial of service attack, i.e., let's gum up the normal election processes by deluging the supervisor of elections so that they can't do their regular job. And then when they collapse, we can point at them and see our elections are bad. Well, you're the ones that are causing the elections to be run in this manner, Mr. Maggot. So I will tell you, this is not sustainable. Election officials should be free from fear in conducting elections in America. And today, Rob, they're not.
Well, Pete Antonelli passed away recently. I don't know what's going on with the elections police now that he passed. Maybe you would have more information on that. But just to go into that, we do, again, we go back to 2018. I think this was a big year because a lot of things from 2018 are going to apply to 2022. 2018, we did pass that constitutional amendment, which was on the ballot to make sure if you had, for felons to have the right to vote. If you had, if you weren't a sex offender or a murderer, then you could get your right, low offenses, drugs, small kind of potato things. You could get your right back to vote. With that said, that passed obviously overwhelmingly by the voters of the state of Florida. Now with the election police, the Tampa Bay Times did a very good reporting where police are out there arresting, and they've arrested 20 people now that, we're told they were able to vote. They registered to vote. Some of these people were lied to by, people that were, or maybe the people were uninformed that were telling them they were able to vote, and they registered, and now they're getting arrested by the police. There's fines. They may have to go to jail. This is kind of ridiculous after that amendment to the Florida state constitution was passed. So
Yes,
again,
yes.
this all goes back to 2018.
Right. The citizens overwhelmingly passed the restoration of civil rights for individuals who have been former felons. And again, most of the people may not realize, but in the southern and border states, for example, as a way to keep the control of the society under the Jim Crow laws, if you were convicted of a felony in Florida, you lost your right to vote forever, in perpetuity, forever. And actually, that changed in 2010 when Charlie Crist created a way that made all non-violent offenders eligible to receive their right to vote back. This was unfortunately an effort that was never really completed because the Florida legislature, a trick that they'll use now, didn't supply the monies necessary to hire the people to process these individuals to allow them to vote. There was a waiting list of over 79,000 people to have their paperwork processed in order to get their right to vote. And what we saw, for example, right now with the arrests that have occurred, let me explain to you that I was a member of what was called the Central Voter File in the late 90s. My Association of Supervisors made me chairman of the Central Voter File Committee. We created a statewide voter registration database in compliance with the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, which said that each state has to have a statewide voter registration system. And what Florida did was we created an excellent one. And the Department of Corrections has a portal into that, as well as the agencies that record deaths. And all of the relevant agencies, the Department of Safety and Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles. So this way, when you register to vote, all of the information should be current on your background in this system. But it's not. And why isn't it? Because Governor DeSantis turned down his appointed Secretary of State's recommendation, Laurel Lee. She wanted 15 individuals after that law passed in 2018 to update the records, to in fact make the records current. All the information was there. If you were convicted as a murderer or a sex offender, that information is there. Governor DeSantis turned down and refused to appropriate the money to update the Florida voter registration database. That information should have been in there. So when the individual came and said, I'd like to register to vote, all of the election official would have to do is send it to the state, and then the state compares it in their database and sends back to the supervisor of elections. No, this individual is not allowed to vote because of this sex offense conviction. They didn't do that. That's why these individuals could register to vote. The election officials don't have access to the portal that the Secretary of State has. All we can see is what the Secretary of State lets us see. So we can't see if the individual is convicted of a murderer or is a sex offender. We can't see that. and the state negligently refused to update it. So these individuals, they're arrested because the state didn't do their work. And I will tell you that on Friday of this past week, Circuit Judge Milton Hirsch in Miami-Dade threw out the first case that the election police brought. He kicked it right out and sent it 100 yards away and said there's absolutely no way these individuals can be prosecuted under this law. And I will tell you, to be in violation of Florida election law, Rob, you have to be, it's a criminal act, so you have to have intent. You actually knowingly have to intend the law to be convicted. And in all of these 20 cases that we know so far, these individuals didn't have a clue that they were not eligible to vote. As you stated, when they went to the Supervisor of Elections office and filled out the application and asked the election official, am I good to go? The Supervisor of Sections will check with the state, send it up to the state, comes back, you're ready to go. Here's your voter registration card, you're ready to vote. Now, whose fault is that? The individual that didn't realize that they were violating the law, or the state that had noticed that they needed to update this and knowingly refused to update it just so they could play gotcha with voters? That's where we are in Florida.
Well, the governor talks a lot about voter fraud, and I know a lot of people in the Florida Republican Party talk about that. Like you said earlier, Ion, the governor said that the 2020 election was the gold standard. I mean, there was no issues in the state of Florida. Second of all, we have seen throughout the instance of voter fraud in the state of Florida in the past election, they were all from the villages. What is the villages? It's the most Republican area in the state of Florida, and even somewhat in the country as far as that goes. And all these people were registered Republican that voted 1, 2, 3, 4 times for, Donald Trump. So, I mean, I'm not trying to be a partisan here, but what's true is true, and what's fact is fact.
Well, not only that, these individuals were given probation. They were given probation.
Yeah.
Individuals who knowingly violated the law, voting a false ballot on behalf of others, living in the Republican area of the villages, were not given any jail time, which I dare say is not going to be what they want to subject the African-American voters who absolutely did not intend to break the law, but are caught through this Byzantine catch-22 system that is now Florida's voter registration system, i.e. with election police to get you. And it's spreading to other states. Virginia, under Youngkins, they just created their election police. So what we're seeing is states like Florida have always been kind of like the school where they create these little plots and ship them out to other states like they did to Georgia, And it's reprehensible. And quite frankly, Rob, what we need is a United States constitutional amendment guaranteeing Americans the right to vote. Most Americans don't realize that because there is absolutely nothing stated in the United States Constitution, you don't have a constitutional right to vote. Your right to vote depends upon what your state lets you do. And you know what? That's not good enough. We need a constitutional amendment saying that all legal voters have the right to vote and not have to jump through all of these crazy rules to be able to make it happen. That's what we need. And before I leave this planet, I'd like to see the United States have that kind of a constitutional amendment, because our system is based upon the citizens making the decisions about who will govern us, going all the way back to the Declaration of Independence. It's there in the Declaration of Independence that a just government depends upon what? The will of the governed. Well, how do you determine the will of the governed? That's why we have elections. That's how the will of the governed is made manifest in the United States system. And we do not let the governed have the decision. We try to put our finger on the scale. And both parties have done it over the years. Let's be honest with it, because again, there's no constitutional right preventing state or political leaders from doing these kind of shenanigans. And I'm fed up with it. It's been since the 2000 elections, I've been much more aware of this because it goes back to the Florida 2000 election when the Florida Secretary of State's office released a false felons list and ordered the Supervisor of Elections to take these felons off the rolls. And it turns out that when I checked the list I received in March of 2000, Rob, it had only 34 legitimate felons on a list that was 697 names long. We took those 34 people off. The rest of the people, or 96%, they could vote. But in many, many jurisdictions, they took all of those people off. And it is estimated today that somewhere in the neighborhood of 18,000 legitimate African-American voters went to the polls in November of 2000 to vote and were turned away. And that is an election in which the margin was 537. So the Republicans learned in Florida that you could cheat and you could get away with it. And that's been the hallmark, in my opinion, of election tactics by the Republicans since then. Florida, we started this.